have to thank Judith and Paul and Allison for their wonderful invitation and organization and facilitation of this session. And I also want to thank everyone who was able to make time to join us this evening, your time, or this midday, our time. It feels as though, as Judith has alluded to, as though the questions that Tim and I are sort of working through in this paper are especially timely for the circumstances that we're navigating here in the U.S. But to my mind, they are also very salient for the circumstances in the U.K. And elsewhere, as we'll discuss a bit towards the end of our talk. So I think Tim is going to get us started, and he will, I believe, share his screen if he's able, as we've got something of a PowerPoint.
Is everyone good with the full screen presentation? Is that visible to everyone? Okay, seeing some nods. Also, just real quickly, I'd like to echo Winston's sentiments. Very honored to be here, and thank you to Paul for the invite, and then Judith and Allison for all their hard work to organize, and thank you to the society as well. So I'll go ahead and jump in and get started here. So just a little introduction to our paper. So we look to namely address a few things. So the first instance we want to cover is we want to provide a definition of monuments. So we all have kind of the same working definition for what we're looking at. And we also want to look at how these monuments spark these removalist or preservationist controversies. So the calls for removal from one side and the calls to preserve the monuments as they stand from the other. We also, as Winston has mentioned, turn our focus to Confederate monuments in the United States, mainly because they present a clear case of racist impacts, and they are clear candidates for the widespread removal, and therefore provide some good context for our argument. We then also turn our attention to existing philosophical arguments aimed at clarifying this controversy, the preservationist removalist controversy, and we draw attention to an especially promising formulation of the moral harm argument presented by Timmerman, which we will go over as well in this presentation. And then lastly, we'll conclude and get to our argument itself. So we will improve upon this argument by offering an educationally sensitive civic harm argument. And in this, we look to advance a view of a limited capability between removalist and preservationist aims. So a quick overview of the article, which will serve as a roadmap of sorts for our presentation today. So we'll start with an introduction, why we believe this topic is important. And then, as I just mentioned, we'll move to what we consider a monument and why, and the current historical context about the debate surrounding monuments, specifically in the United States. We'll then move to describe the moral harm argument and give a robust description of the present arguments that are out there. And we'll look then at the weaknesses of moral harm arguments as we see it, which serves as the groundwork and the framework from which we launch our civic harm argument. We'll look at two specific aspects of the civic harm argument that we believe provide salience in remarkable and special ways, and that is the social cooperation of the civic harm argument and how that addresses that in pluralistic democracies. And then we'll look at how the civic harm argument addresses the educative nature of public spaces relative to monuments. And then we will gladly tell you the strengths of our argument, and then we will reluctantly but freely tell you the weaknesses we see in the argument as well before concluding. So before we jump into the nitty-gritty, the historical context of monuments is deep. So we've provided here just some monuments dating all the way back to 1776, when the removal of the statue of King George III was removed in New York, in New York City, in New York, United States, 5 days after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And then you can see other important monuments or symbols taken down during the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, the upending of a statue of Joseph Stalin. In 1979, the Berlin Wall began to be torn down, opening up East and West Germany for the first time since 1961. During the beginning of the Iraqi War, the Iraqi-US War, the statue of Saddam Hussein was torn down from Firdos Square in Baghdad. And then this past summer, the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, there was a slew of colonial and Confederate monuments across the United States and in the world more generally that spurred argument, these removalist preservation arguments, and many that were torn down. And so the reason we look at those specific monuments is because we feel that they show this salience that and importance that monuments have in the public eye. And across historical periods, monuments have held important civic consequence. The construction of a monument signifies a devotion or loyalty to the ideals it represents. Its destruction then might represent an abnegation of those ideals, a turning of the page to a new chapter of civic life. The construction and destruction of monuments therefore hold significance for the meanings of social life. And we pulled this interpretation from the writings of Umberto Eco. Yet no matter the intended goals of such actions, the destruction of a monument frequently inspires resistance from those committed to the values or perceived values for which they stand. And I'll turn it over to Winston to cover the first part.
Yeah, so thanks, Tim. And, as Tim said, the removal of monuments can be meaningful. And all of the examples that we have there at the beginning of the paper that Tim sort of rehearsed for you all give something of a sense of what we might have in mind when we begin these conversations about, removing monuments and the controversy that such removals might inspire. But we thought that it was important to also define what we mean by a monument, right? I mean, so we've got this intuition pump at the beginning of the paper that sort of brings the reader along into thinking that the removal of monuments might be significant, but what exactly is a monument? How might we separate monuments from things that are objects that might seem to be monuments, but perhaps are not, such that we might sort of home in on the specificity of the circumstances that we're attempting to assess. I see in the chat that there's a good question about whether the Berlin Wall is in fact a monument. Tim and I have discussed this as well, and we're happy to provide some guidance in our interpretation here. But let me run through the three characteristics that we settled upon for our definition of a monument. Firstly, with characteristic A, we recognize that a monument marks something as perceived to be historically significant, right? We might have some quibble about whether, in fact, the object that is being marked is indeed historically significant, but we recognize that there is, at the very least, the assertion that the monument is marking historical significance. And this significance could be connected to a person, to an event, to an idea, etc. I should also note here, for those who haven't read the paper with detail, that we take this characteristic A to actually be a characteristic that is also true of memorials, and we hold memorials to be sort of the larger category within which monuments rest. So we might think that a memorial is any constructed work or of demarcated physical or temporal space in which historical significance is observed. Such that monuments then become a subtype of memorials identified by characteristics B and C, which I'll get into right now. So characteristic B is that, a monument is going to be honorific in its tone. It's going to be celebratory. It reveres, it commemorates. So we might imagine that those memorials which are not monuments. So think here of everything that's in the category of memorials that is not a monument. Those memorials which are not monuments might identify tragic events or events about which public perceptions move towards feelings of sadness, regret, sorrow, etc. So imagine, the loss of many civilian lives by some terrorist act. I'm thinking here of the 9/11 monument in New York City, the 9/11 memorial in New York City, which, for those of you who've been following in the news, was just the subject of a potential bombing. As someone was attempting to perhaps speak to what was being memorialized there. But things like this serve as memorials that are not monuments, as they're recognizing historical significance, but not necessarily trying to mark some strong public approval, some celebration, celebratory aspect of the material that is being designated. We recognize, of course, that in practice, there are many memorials that are sort of a mix of a bit of what we're describing here. Think of the MLK Jr., as we were just celebrating in the US, Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday. The MLK Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. Might be regarded as, in some sense, a memorial that is not a monument, as it is a recognition of sort of some regret at the assassination of this civic leader, but it's also perhaps serves as a bit of a monument, as it reveres this leader. He's depicted as sort of looking off into the distance at a more ideal future. So again, the characteristic B that we identify here is a characteristic of commemoration that is reverential or celebratory. Then finally, characteristic C, which I think is perhaps the most interesting of the characteristics that we've identified. In characteristic C, we note that a monument has this sort of state-owned or state-constructed or state-maintained dimension that sort of confers upon it something of an official status. In the paper, we make a quick reference to the 129 US monuments and the degree to which they represent something of the state's speech, governmental speech, a communication to its citizens about what it values and what it would defend. Without this sort of enduring sort of official status, monuments would then be instances of private speech between persons, in the same way that sort of holding up a sign at a march or a protest might be an instance of private speech rather than governmental speech. And we think that this official status, this characteristic C, is actually going to be quite important for much of what comes in the rest of our argument. So let's move on then to the next slide, and we might ask why we focus on these Confederate monuments. Now, Tim said something about this earlier, and I'll let him say a little bit more. But here, I just want to note that to our minds, Confederate monuments are relatively clear cases for removal, given their attachment to various sort of race-related aims. We think that by focusing on these Confederate monuments as relatively simple cases in which some of the pieces are sort of exaggerated, the details are a bit exaggerated on the two sides of the removal or preservationist debate, our hope is that we can then, through our analysis, come to recognize some features that might be imported into more nuanced context, in which there are going to be some really quite reasonable disagreements regarding removal and preservation. So I'll pass on to Tim here, but I'll just very briefly note that, as Tim mentioned earlier, the George Floyd circumstances of this past summer certainly gave a rise to some of the calls for the removal of these sorts of monuments in ways that relate to some earlier instances of the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as, and I'm sure those of you in the UK are familiar with the phrase, roads must fall Monumental, as that was popular originally in South Africa, then to the UK and the US some years ago. But we were seeing sort of a resurgence of some of these arguments. And so this was a nice opportunity for us to look at the ways in which folks in these movements presented their views, and then sort of take those views, placing them into some more philosophically nuanced categorizations. But Tim, was there something that you wanted to add here as well?
Yeah. In addition to all the good points that Winston has made, there's an interesting factor of the Confederate monuments in the United States that kind of pushes against the preservationist calls. And those are that the calls typically are rooted in this reliance on heritage, which doesn't quite get the context of these individuals memorializing these monuments correct. And it also ignores the time of their construction. So, for instance, the Confederacy was an attack on the United States from some of the succeeded states. So it does not quite make sense that the United States citizens would be memorializing, in all sense of the words, traitors perhaps, or treasonous individuals. The second aspect, that being the time of their construction, if we look at the historical records, we would think perhaps that these monuments for large part went up during the time of the Civil War, so 1861 to 1865 in the United States. But it actually comes about that many of these monuments are constructed much later, during the Jim Crow laws of the Southern United States, where there were oppressive laws restricting the ability for civic participation for Black American citizens. And that was the first wave of these monuments. And the second wave comes about during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which again we've just commemorated and celebrated through Martin Luther King Jr. Day here in the States as a time of great progress. And these facts kind of point to the instance that the monuments are put up as kind of a power grab, or a point to where the dominant class of society is putting up a visible sign of oppression, such that they will try to repress the civic participation of a second-class citizenry. And this is actually backed up through empirical evidence, which shows that in counties of the United States, especially in the South, where these Confederate statues exist, the racial inequalities tend to be larger than even the surrounding counties where these statues don't exist. So the preservationists kind of lose a bit of their persuasiveness of the argument once we kind of reconcile that historical fact. Yeah. And I'll pass it back to Winston again to kind of rehearse these removalist and preservationist talks.
Yeah, so thanks, Tim. And I think that what you've said here is very important and needs to be held in mind as we recognize again, the empirical sort of the facts of the matter about these Confederate monuments, placing sort of, the calls for their preservation in that historical context is exceedingly important. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding these terms as they're used in this this context. Of course, removalists and preservationists are precisely what they sound like, right? I mean, the removalist sort of perspective is the perspective that seeks to remove a monument for whatever reason. In this case, we're sort of focused on harm, a very specific form of a harm argument. And preservationists, want to preserve the existing monuments. Oftentimes, as Tim has suggested, preservationist arguments are sort of couched in terms of, history or culture, values, identity. And it's the case that oftentimes removalist arguments are couched in terms of sort of harm, as we'll be talking about in more detail, justice, as we'll talk about as well. But I think it's important at this moment to note that the sort of the popular forms of these arguments don't often group themselves in the ways that we're going to be describing, right? So there's something slightly artificial about the groupings that we're putting forward, but the groupings that we're putting forward are groupings that are found in the philosophical literature, and we think that these groupings actually hold up remarkably well when placed alongside the sort of articulations of those in the public conversations about either preservation or removal of a monument. And another note to sort of mark here is that it's not the case that we can, despite what I've said a few moments ago, it's not the case that we can simply say that, all harm arguments sort of fall into the removalist camp and all sort of historical arguments fall into the preservationist camp. Rather, what I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do for you very briefly, in the paper we're fairly brief about this as well, but what I'm hoping that we're able to do is to just sort of show you that these are the sort of general categories in which arguments can be launched, and these arguments can be launched in either direction. So moving on to the next slide, it's the case that I'd like to first talk about rights-based arguments. So, again, here is one of the first that we'll be discussing with you this evening, one of the first of the more philosophically sophisticated versions of arguments that are often offered in this removalist preservationist discussion. And so, you might look at some of the work by Helen Froh, who's at Stockholm, who argues that citizens have a right to have monuments of wrongdoers, and her focus is on wrongdoers removed, right? So it's the case that if someone is a wrongdoer, it means that they have sort of breached the rights of others, and other citizens then, in recognition of the sort of the wrong having been done by that individual who is celebrated by the monument, other individuals have some grounds upon which to make a claim that the monument ought to be removed. Now, Froh is interesting here in that she notes that, this is a rights-based perspective that doesn't require the priority of the right to have the monument removed. That is to say, if I am a citizen and I say, look, this monument celebrates this person who has wronged others by breaching their rights, I have a right to have this monument removed from the public space. It doesn't mean that that's the only right that comes into the conversation. And Froh is forthright in noting that there may be other competing rights that ought to have some priority, such that the call for removal doesn't necessarily result in the removal of the monument, as we're trying to sort of juggle the various rights that exist in that public space. Now, of course, we see people like Dan Dimitriou who argue that there is, in fact, a right to a certain type of social cohesion. And this is an argument that you might sometimes, or let me say differently, this is an argument that I sometimes hear, having in recent years moved from one part of the US to another part of the US, the argument being, look, there's a certain type of social cohesion that's being disrupted by these calls for the removal of monuments. And, we have a right to a social unity, to a sense of social unity, to a sense of social cohesion, to a shared identity. And, that is under attack in some ways, or that's being breached by those who wish to remove these sort of, key monuments in our national or more local community discourse. And so, again, this is just one way in which we might begin to recognize that rights-based arguments can move in either direction. So Froh's argument sort of suggesting that there's a right to removal, and Dimitriou's argument is sort of suggesting, well, look, there's a right to preserving these monuments because they maintain a type of social cohesion that is necessary for the work of the civic work that we expect ourselves to be engaged in. Okay, so moving on from rights-based arguments, we can then talk about history-based arguments. And so Tim's earlier remarks about history are particularly of interest here, as oftentimes the sort of history-based argument tries to sort of appeal to the significance of the historical moment in which a monument was constructed, or sort of attempt to prioritize that characteristic A that I mentioned previously, this account of historical significance. And so some people like Daniel Abrams, who is at Glasgow, sort of present a preservationist account, or a preservationist argument in response to these discussions, suggesting, look, the rights-based discourse sort of gets it wrong, because we ought not care, or we ought not prioritize in our considerations the wrongdoing or the moral status of the person who is marked by the monument, right? Whether or not they were a good person or a bad person doesn't matter. What really matters is the historical significance of the person or the event or the idea that is marked. And to the extent that the monument is in keeping with our definition, to the extent that the monument is celebratory, the thing that we ought to be celebrating is that there is this historical significance, right? We're not celebrating the person as a moral exemplar. We're celebrating the fact that there is this historical significance, and that is a subject of some reverence, if you will. And so this is the way in which much of the history-based arguments tend to be explored. Now, finally, I just want to say a very brief word about justice-based arguments before moving on to discuss harm-based arguments. And Joanna Birch Brown at Bristol sort of puts forward an account of justice-based arguments that we think is especially captivating, in that she notes that the pursuit of the sort of ideal, the pursuit of sort of a vision of progress, is sort of a part of every society. Every state is sort of iterating towards a better version, we would hope, or it's aspiring towards, we would hope, a better version of itself. And in that aspirational sort of trajectory, there are going to be moments in which it needs to revise parts of itself. And so, one way of understanding Birch Brown's position here is that, simply because a society has had a failing in the past, it needn't be confined to sort of living with that failure in perpetuity, right? Let's imagine that a particular society is, it's been colonialist in various ways, or it's been misogynist in various ways, or racist in various ways. That is certainly a part of that society's history. But it need not, because of that history, sort of reify those parts of itself. That is to say, it might acknowledge that historical pattern of behavior or of actions, but it might also release or let go of certain signs or symbols that are expressive of values that are, quite frankly, out of date, given the justice-oriented aspirations of that society. And so for those reasons, we might think of these sorts of justice-based arguments as being arguments about updating a society or a state, right? A state updating itself in line with the values that it has reason to defend and endorse into the future. Okay, so given these approaches, I'd like to now move us on to thinking about the moral harm arguments. So it's the case that, we've now talked with you about rights-based arguments, history-based arguments, sort of justice-based or justice-oriented arguments. And there's another category of arguments in these removalist, preservationist debates, and these are harm-based arguments. To our mind, a particularly elegant version of these arguments is found in Travis Timmerman's account. Now, Timmerman's account is relatively simple, and to some extent, the simplicity is a part of the elegance. basically Timmerman's argument in relation to moral harm, and he doesn't quite use the term moral harm, but the harm that he identifies is surely a moral harm. You know, in his moral harm argument, he sort of suggests that if there is a sort of a harm that is visited upon a person, we might think of this moral harm as perhaps a particular monument's intent in communicating or serving as an unavoidable reminder of some previously communicated indignity or assertion of inferior status on the basis of a morally irrelevant criterion such as racial identity, right? If it's the case that there's going to be this type of harm, then there's going to be a strong moral reason for calling for its removal, right? And Timmerman also suggests that in these instances in which this undue and unavoidable harm experienced through the expression of the values contained in the presence of a particular type of monument, if that harm is present, Timmerman argues that there exists no equally strong countervailing moral reason to preserve the monument. So someone might claim, well, look, yeah, okay, Timmerman, we acknowledge that there's this harm to citizens who have to walk past this particular monument on the way to the market or and so forth. But what about the history, right? What about preserving the history? Well, Timmerman would say, look, that history-based argument is not a compelling account that sort of has equal weight or equal value when recognizing the type of moral harm, the sort of dignitary harm that follows from the first part of his argument. So this is sort of the very basics of the moral harm argument as expressed through Timmerman. Now, moving on to the next slide, I'd like to just say a little bit about the merits of this argument. Now, I've said a little bit about the merits here in response to that to the history-based argument, and that's sort of the second of the points that you see on your screen here. That the sort of the history-based argument, those claims are just not strong enough to outweigh harms to persons. But there are two other merits that I just want to flag for us here in the moral harm in relation to the moral harm arguments. Firstly, the moral harm argument, it doesn't have to interrogate whether historical actions constitute some breach of rights as understood in a contemporary context or a historical context. So what I mean by this is that, the rights-based arguments are really focused on finding, a wrongdoer, right? Or some of the rights-based arguments are focused on the existence of a wrongdoer. But, the moral harm argument says, look, we don't have to determine whether or not, this person, having race-based preferences at this sort of past moment in history, does that not constitute wrongdoing given historical context and so on and so forth, right? We don't have to sort of filter through all of that. We need only ask ourselves about the contemporary context in which harm is being visited upon citizens in the here and now. And so we see that as something of an improvement in terms of sort of clarifying or offering some clearer, if you will, context for negotiating some of the sorts of claims that might be made under the banner of the harm argument. Related to this, and this is in some ways, an observation of a type of sort of weakness that we'll talk about further, but there may also be contrasting rights claims, that the rights-based arguments have to then arbitrate. So let's imagine that we have, instances in which, as alluded to earlier, as we're thinking about Fro and Dimitriou's two accounts, right? The rights-based account that sort of suggests that, by focusing on finding wrongdoers, the individual in the current moment has a right to having the monument removed, and Dimitriou sort of suggesting that there is a right to social cohesion that would be preservationist in its orientations. What we find attractive about the moral harm argument is that you don't have to now sort of arbitrate between these two sorts of accounts of rights, right? I mean, so whose rights ought to have priority? We certainly have a view about this that we think we can certainly justify, but persons need not get sort of bogged down or sort of drawn into a discussion about about how to prioritize the rights of one group over the rights of another, or the asserted rights of one group over the asserted rights of another. And then finally on this slide, I just will say a quick word about justice-based arguments and how the moral harm argument is to us an improvement. Again, it's an improvement because it resists some of the ambiguity of justice-based arguments. And we'll say something more about the types of ambiguity that it does have, but it resists some of the ambiguity of the justice-based arguments, as these justice-based arguments really do sort of require that there is some consensus regarding the ideal that society is moving towards, or that a given population ought to be attending to. I mean, this is a big problem in many, or said differently, this is a problem that's been identified by many folks who are doing quite good work thinking about the difference between ideal and non-ideal theory in conversations about justice. In this instance, all that Tim and I hope to identify is that if it's the case that there's disagreement about what that more utopian future would look like, that more sort of perfect version of our society might look like, then there could be some real quite reasonable disagreement about whether to remove or preserve a monument. So the moral harm argument avoids this as well by suggesting that, look, we needn't agree about what the ultimate aims or goals ought to be, but we can recognize the claims being made in this moment that there's a moral harm occurring, and we can proceed from there. Okay, so let me say something, as I alluded to, about weaknesses of the moral harm argument. There are, as I said before, there is some mediation that might need to take place in regard to these moral harm arguments, and the mediation or the arbitration isn't about rights, but it is perhaps about harm. So here we might think about, former President Donald Trump's executive orders, particularly the executive order on the protection of monuments, memorials, and statues that sort of came out in the summer, in which former President Trump suggested that there were these movements to sort of remove monuments, and that these movements and that these sort of activities towards the removal of monuments represent in some ways a mischaracterization of sort of the truth of American identity, and they were an attack on quote unquote our ideals, our values, our identity, right? So there's a way in which you might read sort of Trump here, as well as in his remarks on Columbus Day, sort of revering the figure of Christopher Columbus and sort of calling for the defense of all sort of monuments to Columbus, which is a relatively noteworthy issue here in Columbus, Ohio, a city named after that figure. It's the case that you might come to understand that there is a claim being made by the preservationists that they are indeed being harmed, right? There is a harm occurring. There is a loss of identity. We are under attack in ways that are similar to the sort of the rights-based arguments that I alluded to earlier, particularly that social cohesion version of the rights-based argument. So there is something that's necessary here about mediating sort of these claims of harm. Now, of course, there are some versions of these claims of harm that and I'll speak in my own singular voice in this moment, that I would be relatively comfortable not dismissing out of hand, but dismissing with very limited evidence brought to bear. I mean, so for example, someone might claim, I earlier alluded to the monument, the memorial / monument of Martin Luther King Jr. Some might claim that there is a harm, that they are experiencing a harm posed by that that monument, as that monument suggests something of the priority of a Black struggle for civil rights. This is the sort of argument that you hear in the U.S. In the sort of all lives matter kind of category in response to the Black Lives Matter statements, right? So it's the argument that the specificity of a particular expression represents in some way a loss to another, or an indignity to another who is not identified in the group being the group being addressed. So again, there are these quite real considerations about mediating claims of harm that I think we need to take seriously, even while recognizing that these are not the same as sort of the ways in which rights are invoked by, rights might be understood as existing in two different directions that are at conflict with one another. I think that these harm-based disagreements are likely more superficial than those more enduring rights-based contentious issues. So given that asymmetry of moral harms, I'll just say something about the second of the weaknesses that Tim and I have identified. One weakness of the moral harm argument is that it doesn't really say much that is positive. What I mean here is that there's the sort of the negative liberty obligations of the state. The state may have an obligation to remove those things that are harmful, but the moral harm argument doesn't really give us very much in terms of a sort of positive liberty, an orientation toward the positive liberty obligations that states might have towards their citizens. And just a quick note here to say that in our paper, we use the term citizens, but it's an imperfect term. We don't mean legal citizens. We mean persons who are engaged in the work of the civic community. So we, in this second weakness, we take it to be the case that there are indeed some positive positive liberty obligations that states have towards their citizens, and we think that the moral harm argument doesn't really give us a good foundation for recognizing some of what the state might owe to its citizens. And with that in mind, we're looking towards a future argument that might sit in some ways in support of the moral harm argument. So in the next slide here, you'll see exactly what I've just articulated. We are hoping to offer something to supplement, to strengthen, to again work in tandem with the moral harm argument, while also building upon and strengthening its, by our perception, its weaker points. And so in this, we then wish to move towards a civic harm argument. So in the next slide, you'll see that our version of the civic harm argument tries to accomplish a few things. Firstly, it attempts to define harm with a bit more detail. So though we like, again, the moral harm argument, particularly that very wonderful version offered by Travis Timmerman, we think that we can provide a little bit more detail about the type of harm that we have in mind. Again, note that Timmerman identifies his argument as a harm argument. We add to that analysis and recognize his account as a moral harm argument. And then we wanted to say something a little bit further than that and sort of articulate a more specific type of harm that is a civic harm. You might also understand this as a civic moral harm. For purposes that we can get into, we use the language of civic harm. And it's also the case that this civic harm argument is educationally sensitive. And we see this as a real boon to the argument, that the argument or the category of arguments can sort of anticipate the positive liberty obligations that states have to their citizens. And for this reason, and for others that we'll get into, it is the case that it's an educationally sensitive category of harm in these conversations. So staying on this slide for a few moments longer, let me just say that our argument here, the civic harm argument, is basically that civic harms are those that are injurious to the always developing civic status of persons. If a particular monument presents an unavoidable civic harm to an undeserving person or persons, such as perhaps teaching persons that some citizens ought to have a lesser status as citizens than others, then there exists at least three interconnected categories of strong civic reasons for removing that argument. For removing that monument. And so these are the categories that we've identified here: Category 1, Category 2, and the creatively named Category 3. And so it's the case that these categories are our attempt at giving a sense of some of, it's not meant to be exhaustive, but some of the civic harms that we have in mind and that we're trying to sort of prevent or control for. The first category of these civic harms is sort of what we might think of as kind of direct harms to a particular subject, right? So direct harms to a person. These are going to be the social and political impacts upon persons that are deemed as inferior within a civic context. So you can imagine it's the civic harm that is the disenfranchisement of enslaved persons at some earlier moments in United States history, right? These are civic harms that are direct and sort of clear, for lack of a better term. Category 2 civic harms are going to be, to some extent, indirect civic harms, and they're largely epistemic harms. They might impact the subjects of that first category, those who are directly impacted, but they might also impact others in the society around them. But these are going to be these indirect and epistemic harms that have some impact upon who's considered as sort of counting, or who's considered as being authentically being an authentic participant in the civic context. So here you might have some xenophobic rhetoric that sort of questions, one immigrant group's status within a country. So here in the US, and I suspect this is also the case in the UK, given what I've read and observed, it's the case that these sorts of arguments, these sorts of harms are going to be the sorts of things that kind of eat away at, an individual's own sense of their status in that civic community, or the sense that people have about other members of their civic community as being members to whom they ought to be responsive, right? The epistemic indirect category of harm. And then finally, if the first category is sort of, the first two categories kind of focus on individual persons as the recipients of these harms, Category 3 civic harms are going to be kind of aggregate losses to the quality of community. That is to say, you might imagine here that, if you've got certain forms of civic harm, not only are you harming individuals sort of directly, not only are you indirectly harming individuals by creating an epistemic landscape in which they are not able to be properly or duly recognized as participants, but you're also sort of degrading the quality of the community itself. That is, the potential for conclusions that or solutions that are the result of collaboration and dialogue and discussion with diverse groups, that possibility is significantly diminished. So you've got a degraded quality of the community. So these are the aggregate losses of Category 3 type harms. So we think that harm in any of these categories would be sufficient for removal. And to our mind, Confederate monuments, for reasons that we'll get into, certainly seem to be the sorts of monuments that are going to be in breach of these sorts of standards, in that they create harms in these categories. So moving on, I'll just very briefly say, before turning the microphone over to Tim, who's been so patient with my long-windedness, it's the case that to our argument, there are two interesting educational considerations that ought to be understood. Firstly, monuments are indeed educative. And focusing on that fact might change how we think of the purposes that get served by either preservation or removal, right? So thinking primarily of, sort of the ways in which these monuments have recalling um, our definition of monuments. They have this sort of official status. They represent government speech. Recognizing this, their expressive quality is indeed an educative quality. And so you might hear sort of rest upon the idea that there is always, some, if you will, for lack of a better term, there is always some curriculum that the government is expressing. And so the question is not whether the government ought to express, but the question is, what will the government be expressing? Will the state be expressing through the monuments, preservation or removal? And so that might sort of shift or change our considerations as we think about monuments as being educative in this way, recognizing some of the positive liberty obligations that states might have towards sort of educating citizens. And then the second point that I'll make before concluding is that the public space might not be the best context for a monument, right? So some monuments may miseducate, they might be maleducative, they might visit upon persons, category 2 civic harms, those epistemic and indirect harms, such that the public space of sort of the roadside on my way to the market might not be the best place for a Confederate monument that might communicate to me and to others something about our status in a diverse society. Okay, Tim, please.
Yeah, thank you, Winston. Yeah, so let me pull up my notes here real quick. So the first kind of arm that we rest our civic harm argument on is this idea of social cooperation. And we look at this kind of in the ways that these monuments, as Winston's pointed out, may not lead to this category 1 direct civic harm, where there's a direct harm to the status of persons in society, but they often lead to these category 2s and category 3 civic harms. One large aspect of this is that these calls for removal or preservation serve as kind of a large proxy to the ongoing political fraction within the United States. So this typically we can see that those calling for removal might fall onto the more liberal side of American politics, while those calling for preservation often fall on the more conservative side. Of course, this isn't a hard, fast line, but it typically tends to hold true for that. And these fractures are often exacerbated by these proxy harm arguments, or these arguments that serve as a proxy, and the moral harm arguments too swiftly kind of discount in our mind the claims of the preservationists in a lot of sense that they might be also harmed. And that's to say that we don't necessarily find these preservationist claims persuasive. We're not saying, well, there certainly is a moral harm that you're given. We recognize that, but we're kind of extending the olive branch in a sort of way that says, well, we hear you, and we understand that this frustrates kind of our ability to reconcile and make a strong moral harm argument to remove these controversial arguments. And our hope in doing this, and our hope in addressing these harms raised by preservationists, is that when we see them in some way valid, when we come to the table and say these are valid arguments, we open up kind of the avenues for the other side of our interlocution to say, well, where perhaps might we find the proper context for these monuments, and really have them realize their educative purposes. And in that we recognize that when monuments are properly contextualized, they kind of serve this pedagogical role that they have. If, as Winston said, if I'm walking to the market and I turn to my right and I see a statue of a Confederate general, I might wrongly assume that we should celebrate that person in a lot of senses. But when the monument is put into perhaps a museum or given a larger context, we can see what that monument should represent. We see that Confederate monument is perhaps a point to the historical frissions or factions that we have, and we can move towards perhaps a more perfect union in terms of the United States. And then our second arm of our argument is this recognition that public spaces are rarely, if ever, the proper spaces for education in the context of monuments to occur. And we rest this on kind of the interpretation stemming from Dewey, and then also carried forth in other research, that education is a continual process. So education doesn't just occur in schools. It doesn't just occur in the context where we say this is education. We're always learning. We're always taking in our surroundings and our environment, and that is education. And when those public spaces are not properly contextualized or present instances that run counter to factual evidence, this isn't an educational environment, and it doesn't provide for education in substantive ways. So then we look at taking in this light that education is this continual process, the intent of Confederate monuments to be wholly positive. And that is that we kind of concede. We'll say, okay, well, if your intent from this monument is to memorialize or see this person in a positive light, we understand that to be an argument. But that also doesn't mean that we ought to ignore the other implicit facts or instances that monument brings forth. So that's to say, here's your intent, but here is kind of the effect. And, again, that's backed up by kind of this empirical evidence that shows these inequalities that persist. And so we base this in a democratic sense, where we want citizens to work together and find these commensurable terms of bringing differing symbols of meaning. And we base this in a Habermasian approach, kind of through Mead and Durkheim, of referencing the generalized other or the ego and the alter, and show that the environment and not just the individuals affect the way in which we are socialized, in which we learn the norms and structures of our society. That being said, we can see someone who might have only been exposed to right-wing ideology can't really find the terms of left-wing ideology to kind of have that conversation. So these are kind of the instances that are kind of degrade our public ability to have fruitful conversations, in which we feel that the civic harm argument addresses in really positive and strong ways. So we say that public spaces, have these political and educational aspects to them, and because public spaces are arbitrated by the state and by the political apparatus, the state, therefore, in referencing the moral harm argument, which doesn't point to the state has a vested interest in making sure that the civic and social aspects of its citizenry, of its the individuals that are affected by its actions, they're vested in making sure that those interactions serve to be productive and serve to be constructive in meaningful ways. So this obligation is both political and pedagogical in nature, and thus the state has that positive role to intervene within these arguments and say, well, perhaps this is what we ought to do with this monument. So it moves past that simple removalist preservationist argument and looks towards a hopefully purely objective third party to arbitrate. So we find some specific strengths in our civic harm argument that we feel are helpful when added upon the moral harm argument. First is that it's based in historical and continual recognition of moral harms, and this falls in line with moral harm arguments. So we're not ignoring that moral harms are occurring, we're only saying that we perhaps might recognize the moral harms and then take an extra step further to look towards how we can reconcile that in productive ways. It also falls in line with the justice-based arguments as it seeks to iterate towards justice and the reconciliation of these harms. So the civic harm argument isn't saying that we recognize these harms, but we shouldn't do anything about it. We also create these iterative processes towards justice that we ought to be making in society. And it does these two things, but most importantly, while it has these good aspects, it also removes the burden of proof needed to demonstrate one harm against one group is greater than harm done to another. So again, this is something that we certainly have an opinion on, as Winston pointed out earlier, but because we have an opinion on it doesn't mean that we can't recognize that it perhaps is stifling to some of the progress that can be made. So when we have one group that makes a claim of moral harm and another group that makes a similar claim to moral harm in an opposite fashion, we can perhaps say, these two are obviously moral harms, and it creates this civic harm that leads to the inability for us to communicate back and forth. So we're going to look towards another direction. We're going to recognize these harms, perhaps in the back of our head, knowing that we side with one side over the other, and move towards a more productive space. And then in that, it acknowledges the claims that both parties, as important in the civic aspects in the makeups of society. So we have to have these two factions in a lot of cases in society. There's a natural occurrence, perhaps. And we acknowledge that we have to have both parties at the table to make substantive progress in those iterations towards justice. We also feel that the civic harm argument provides flexibility in its approach. In one way, we can look at monuments as hate speech in a lot of ways. This becomes really important in the broader context of the international climate, as hate speech laws in the United States are excessively forgiving in some aspects. But when we look at this further, we can say, well, this hate speech and showing that this creates these civic harms, these degradations to certain segments of the population in reference to Category 2 and Category 3 civic harms, we ought to then move these monuments to a space where we can reconcile these harms in meaningful ways. And this recontextualization allows for monuments to serve as sustaining educational solutions, stimulating a critical evaluation of history rather than the purely reactive one, which a lot of the arguments, removalist and preservationist arguments rely on. And then lastly, we have the weaknesses of our civic harm argument. We acknowledge that perhaps this civic harm argument seems like we are giving too much to the other side. And in that, it doesn't do as much positive work towards iterations of justice. That certainly is something that we want to take up, and we want to make sure that we understand, and you all understand that this isn't something that, again, we're not conceding to the other side of the argument, but this is certainly a valid levy against our argument. And then I'll pass the baton once again to Winston to finish up this portion as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. I mean, so I'm looking at the clock and seeing the time that we have remaining, and so just to conclude, it's the case that what we have done here is we've focused on the types of arguments that could be offered towards clarifying dimensions of the preservationist removalist controversy. We've homed in on harm arguments, particularly taking note of the moral harm arguments offered by Timmerman and those like him, and we've then extended those harm arguments into some new directions by suggesting a civic harm argument that is going to be educationally sensitive for the reasons that we've mentioned. Though we recognize some of the weaknesses that Tim has just articulated here, we think that these weaknesses don't give adequate cause for discarding the civic harm argument, as again, the civic harm argument is meant to sit sort of alongside or as supplement in many ways to other harm arguments, particularly the moral harm argument. And our hope is that these two categories of argumentation taken in tandem will present some clarity regarding far more contentious issues of preservational removal than our core focus, namely Confederate monuments. So looking forward to the questions in the chat, to be sure. Thank you.